welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. In this episode, we'll offer some thoughts inspired by Erich Voegelin, a German philosopher of 20th century. The man, for those who don't know, the man who was relatively famous for introducing the term of Gnosticism as a continuous metaphysical attitude stretching from antiquity to modern age, and more or less, I would say, judging the most of what we consider political metaphysics or ideologies of modernity to be Gnostic, in fact. And Gnostic, the term Gnostic he uses in quite a Christian sense when it comes to evaluation of the usefulness and moral quality of Gnostic ideas. That is to say, both usefulness and morality of Gnosticism equals zero. So my own opinion about the matter being things like Marxism, communism, wokeism, popular today in the West, but also some phenomena of my own neck of the woods, of which I'll speak later, converge to some extent with Voegelin's ideas. Now, without further ado, we'll read some passages from his New Science of Politics, where he tries to define the Gnosticism of modernity and some implications thereof. So please bear with me, I will read some passages and comment on them. Quote, speaking about Gnostic, quote-unquote, dream world, Voegelin says, the phenomenon of a dream world based on definite principles requires some explanations. It would hardly be possible as a historical mass phenomenon unless it were rooted in the fundamental experiential drive. Gnosticism as a counter-existential dream world can perhaps be made intelligible as the extreme expression of an experience that is universally human, that is, of a horror of existence and the desire to escape from it. So let's unpack this. Voegelin has his own idiosyncratic, peculiar terminology that needs some explanation. So when he says that the phenomenon of dream world is based as a principle of understanding the world, as a principle of mentality, as we on Kali Tribune would say, that is to say, principle that mind identified itself with, that it is based in fundamental experiential drive, means that it is founded in some way on distortion of reality. That is to say, the man's a real relation to reality that is somehow being impeded, something between cause and effect, something inserted, some kind of, let's say, broken mirror, or I don't know, maybe darkened or colored piece of glass, so that, or prism that breaks the light and makes relations crooked that should be straight. It is based upon, that is to say, this principle of dream world, on the horror of existence. That is to say, on the rejection of what is experienced. Not in an empirical sense, but what is experienced by intellect. Because intellect experiences being, in a sense, wherefore I would qualify this world experience, because Voegelin works from terminology of modern philosophy going back towards the roots, whereas we on Kali Tribune try as much as possible to really ditch the modern terminology and use the terminology that scholastics ancients themselves used without attempt to give it a new formulation. I'm not sure, and I think Voegelin would disagree with me, that there is a need to reformulate things. But he worked in different age. He died in 1985, I think, so it was still modernity, more or less. We live in a quite different postmodern age. That is to say, age that went deep into dissolution of modernity. So Voegelin continues, a society, when it exists, will interpret its order as part of the transcendent order of being. This self-interpretation of society as a mirror of cosmic order, however, is part of social reality itself. The ordered society, together with its self-understanding, remains a wave in the stream of being. The Aeschylean, meaning Aeschylus, polis, with its ordering decay, meaning justice, is an island in a sea of demonic disorder, precariously maintaining itself in existence. Only the order of an existing society is intelligible. Its existence itself is unintelligible. Now, what he means here is that order of society, not meaning by this written constitution or something like that, but what is understood as justice. Not legality, but justice as what is good, not what is lawful, but what is more fundamental, is something that is based on the kind of insight in the original order of being itself, of creation itself, I would add, from, let's say, this traditional perspective. That is, in a word, it is based on a givens of the world, and given implies creation. But it is not understood as creation itself, in a sense that order of society is order of being. It is the reflection of the order of being that is more or less accurate. And something that is outside this symbolic representation, as Voegelin quite correctly, I think, formulates it. What is beyond this representation, not beyond, outside, is a chaos of wilderness, of jungle, of barbarism, and so on and so forth. Let us continue. Voegelin says, it is a reasonable assumption, therefore, that in every society there is present, in varying degrees of intenseness, the inclination to extend the meaning of its order to the fact of its existence. Especially when a society has a long and glorious history. He means Roman Empire here. Its existence will be taken for granted as part of the order of things. It has become unimaginable that a society could simply cease to exist. And when a great symbolic blow falls, as for instance when Rome was conquered in 410, a groan went through the orbis terrarum, that now the end of the world had come. In every society, thus, is present an inclination to extend the meaning of order to the fact of existence. But in predominantly Gnostic societies, this extension is erected into a principle of self-interpretation. This shift from a mood, from a lassitude, to take existence for granted, to a principle, determines a new pattern of conduct. Let's unpack this because this is very important. By the way, Voegelin doesn't want to say here that Rome was built on Gnostic principle. Quite the contrary. What he wants to say is that in a society as was a Roman Republic and later a Roman Imperium or Roman Empire, there is this tendency, because of its power and its, quite frankly, success in a sense that is quite difficult to translate in modern terms, people tended to see it as conflated with an order of being, because, as we know, the order of being is, among other things, qualified by stability, because being derives from eternity, not from time and history. However, societies do come from history and are finite. And therefore, in such society as Roman society, the the breakup of the society resembles the end of the world, the end of being itself. But there is a difference, and I won't go into quoting Voegelin on Augustine. He analyzed Saint Augustine's Civitate Dei, the Civitate Dei, where Augustine speaks of the ruin of Rome and the right understanding of the order of being, where you must not understand that the true society or civitas, the true city is the earthly historical city, but the true city is the body of Christ, and so on. This is more or less common knowledge on superficial level of what Augustine thinks about that. But my point is that a Roman virtue, let's say, some of the qualities of the Roman state were preserved to this day, to a large extent, maybe more than we are aware of. We who live on the territories quite close to the center and even centers when the empire split in two of the Roman Empire should know this, at least should know. Not everybody knows, but we should know, because there is a lot of it still in existence through our mores, through our laws, through our conduct, through church, through many things. What he wants to say here is that this lazy inclination, and quite human inclination, to identify your own qualities with the qualities of your creator, in fact, of what only creator can create, that is to say, being, is a quite normal, quite painful when it breaks down, but it's not a final breakdown, because sooner or later, men of practical sense, men who are men enough to face the darkness of chaos, realize that everything that came into being has to go out of being also in this historical world. And so they preserve, in a practical sense, a lot. But Gnostic is different. Gnostic principle is different. I will repeat one passage. In every society, thus, is present an inclination to extend the meaning of order to the fact of existence. But in predominantly Gnostic societies, this extension is erected into a principle of self-interpretation. Now, what this means? This means that the idea that society is, in fact, human society is, in fact, a reflection, not only reflection, but the real order of being, whereas what is outside is the horror of existence, that is to say, the being itself, the ground on which everything else is built, is something that should be escaped from. Once such society starts to break down, there is no practical way of rescuing anything in it. It breaks down completely. It goes into nothing. And this is what Voegelin, this is why Voegelin calls these Gnostic societies dreamworld. Because they are, in fact, products of fantasy that willfully detached itself from being, from the very fact of intellectual one could even call it discovery of the world, what is in the background of everything we think. What we call, in fact, natural. Sometimes we call it common sense, and so on and so forth. Sense of reality, and so on and so forth. Now, let us go from abstractions into examples. So I think it will make things clearer. By Gnostic societies, concretely in these passages, he talks about Nazi Germany, but interestingly enough, he talks about the victors over Nazi Germany also. He have some very interesting ideas. However, Nazi Germany is quite an easy target. I will give you an example of the formerly existing country called Yugoslavia, which I mention from time to time, and in which my own country, Croatia, was one of the member states, because Yugoslavia was a federation. Now, as you probably know, Yugoslavia was a communist creation. It had very peculiar ideology. Now, it was built, as Voegelin would no doubt agree, on a Gnostic principle by the very fact that it was a Marxist-based state, because Voegelin singles out Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche as ultimate in modern Gnostics, and I think he does it in a very admirable way, and Hegel also, three of them. I will not go deep into how he demonstrates this. I will just say a few things. For instance, for Marxism, he says that the telltale sign of the Gnostic character of Marx is that is based upon a prohibition of questions. Now, you may infer now that he thinks about communist repression, but no, he's talking about young Marx, so-called Marx philosophical, anthropological, and I would even say anti-theological writings from Marx's younger age, before Capital, before Communist Manifesto, and those things. Because he notices, and I won't go into quotations now, it's a long quotation, and I think in Paris manuscripts of Marx, this idea that Marx, for all intents and purposes, affirms that it is a natural thing for human being, as a being of nature, as he defines it, to ask or a question, to put forward the question of his origin. So Marx assumes that man is completely immanent product of nature. Immanence here meaning what is completely detached of any transcendence. So from anything that is out of the visible world. And as such, man forms himself like in evolution through work, through creates or recreates his essence through continual work and struggle with nature. And then he says there is human mind has to ask a question where he comes from. And Marx says this question is wrong. That is to say, this question is natural, but it cannot be answered. Why it cannot be answered? Well, easy. Because if there is an answer to this question, or indeed if there is no answer but you pursue it nonetheless, you will never create a socialist man. He's very explicit about it. I'm just paraphrasing. Therefore, there is a natural tendency to ask metaphysical question, a question that leads you, as Voegelin assumes, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, to the divine, what he calls divine ground of existence, in the widest possible sense of a term, because this is the ground that intellect comes from to rest in. even before Christian revelation. And, Voegelin finds it in many places, especially in Aristotle. In Aristotle and Plato. He likes to rely on two of them, especially on Aristotle, because in Aristotle you have this kind of methodical demonstration of historicity of this question. How this question in history, as Greeks understood history in, let's say, a kind of circular, spirally circular way, repeats itself when people ask the questions, from the most obvious things in nature that make them wonder towards the realization of the existence of God, or better to say in Aristotle's case, of the divine, that there is a divine cause, divine origin, whereas cause is a very, very content and meaning rich word, not mechanical cause, of course. Now Marx, interestingly enough, he prohibits this question very explicitly. First by saying that it is natural, but that it must not be asked. Because if it is asked, there is an answer to it. And this is something that you won't hear today that much. But Marx, who was a genuine atheist, knew, as Voegelin says, and I agree, he knew that there is an answer. He didn't want that answer. Because if that answer would be given, you could never become socialist man. Because socialist man is a creation of a natural man. Natural man does not merely reform himself as a completely contingent accident of nature. He creates himself and recreates everything backwards. So this is the acme of Gnosticism, of what Voegelin calls Gnosticism, and I to some extent agree. This is projection of the principle that is in transcendental sense always in the past, because cause is always in the past, to the future. So the cause does not exist and will not exist. But you must go towards it. This, I know this sounds contradictory. It is contradictory. The idea is contradictory. And you have it now in a whole range of other philosophies that are ruling in academia, from neo-Marxists or Marxist Heideggerians or post-humanists, inhumanists, you name them. And this is very interesting thing, because this is not merely an utopia, because utopia, when Thomas More called it utopia, his book, he didn't give it that name for nothing. It is utopia because it is an overland, and he was very much aware that it will remain an overland. In Marx, as for instance today in other neo-Marxists, as Heideggerians, for instance, who combine Marx and Heidegger to some extent, you have this idea of event or some kind of coming to pass of being from the future, from nothing, from which is not still present, but being in the sense that is completely bereft of any qualities. No qualities in it. There is nothing you can say about actual content of this new world that is coming, or revolution, or whatever. Nothing. It's nothing towards which you have to open yourself. And to do this, and this is Voegelin's great insight, to do this, you have to reject something that is quite natural to you. And mind you, if you study history of modern philosophy, you cannot help but notice that real fathers of modern philosophy, as Kant, for instance, or Hegel, but more pronouncedly Kant, when they rejected something as in Kant's case, metaphysics and metaphysical questions, that is to say precisely what Voegelin is talking about here, they rejected them as a natural malady of the mind. They affirmed that they are natural, that they are congenial, that we have them in ourselves for some reason. And they only differed in the way how they explained those reasons. For Marx, it's an alienation because we are not in a communist society, and we cannot know the truth of the world before we change the world. So it's a catch-22. But for Kant, for instance, it's a natural tendency of mind to go over its borders. And Kant considered this unwarranted. And very important is to notice that the whole of that philosophy, with all that speech of human freedom and such thing, is based on restrictions. To culminate, in my opinion, for instance, in Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, when he says that, in paraphrase, to the meaningless question, you cannot give a meaningful answer, which means that absolutely all questions of philosophy, and I mean all, what is beautiful, what is good, or is there a God, and what is the ground of being, and why, most important, original metaphysical question, why the cosmos is what it is and not something different. This is the original question. Thrown out completely. Wittgenstein is interesting because he, in the introduction to this book, in the foreword, he says that he doesn't care did anybody think what he thinks before him. He didn't want to study history of philosophy because, I'll quote him, he said, I'll go mad if I read Hegel. So he has no relation to this tradition, only to Frege, Bertrand Russell, some others. Now, this is also symptomatic. This you have in the father of positivism, Auguste Comte, who also, and Voegelin speaks a lot about, writes a lot about him, he also had this mental hygiene, as he calls it, not reading of the things that contradict his faith in the absolute value of positivism, his positivist church. So that's the basis of Gnostic society. Now, when such society falls, such society therefore in theory is not based on existence as an act of being that we all have to deal with. And when such societies are indeed created, they are always making, at least in a theoretical sense, impediments to the reality of how things really work in the world. But to some extent, of course, they have to adjust. And I was talking about Yugoslavia. It is a very good example of such project, because Yugoslavia was a country that paid absolutely no heed to a concrete history of its people. That is to say, it was based on the myths and negations of facts, of very mundane facts of historiography. And as such, it served the ideology of it being the fulfillment of historical process. What it ended up being in the end was that the historical process that stemmed from the real histories of the peoples who lived in it, destroyed it utterly. Now, this is a long story, and this needs a lot of argument. I am only using it as an illustration, so bear with me. Maybe you can ask me some questions about it later. To this day, you have a phenomenon called Yugo-nostalgia. That is to say, obviously, a nostalgia for the time of Yugoslavia. For instance, and it has many forms. One form is sentimental, and of it I am guilty too, but I am not nostalgic about political system. I am nostalgic about my childhood. And also the world that was less advanced than today's world, because who saw the breakup of Yugoslavia from inside the Yugoslavia, as I had, for instance, saw the breakup of modernity, of classical high modernity. Because communism, as I often repeat, at least in Europe, preserved the things that were already quite eroded in non-communist society further west, and that's something we realized only too late after maybe 20 years ago after the breakup. It became obvious. But there is another form of nostalgia, and this is the nostalgia for the Gnostic principle. Not for communist system, mind you, although it is almost always leftist. Not almost, it is always comes from the left, but it is the nostalgia for the principle. And it is a very peculiar thing. A lot of people who suffer from this are considered to be foremost intellectuals in the countries that came after the breakup of Yugoslavia, especially in Croatia, because one could even say it was also, this is very important, a nationalist idea. It was the idea of giving Southern Slavs a nation. But the problem is that Southern Slav, this is a hybrid nation of Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Macedonians, Bosnians, and others. So it was as such an idea that was not built in the real knowledge of history or real reality of history, but in a kind of utopia. Utopia that was colored with 19th century ideas. But in the 20th century, it became, it evolved into communist solution. And now, when it does not exist, only it exists in the mind of Yugo-Gnostics, it is a postmodern Gnosticism. They sometimes use Badiou's idea of event of Yugoslavia, something that is coming from the future, from the nothingness. It survived. Country didn't survive because it was complete mishmash of everything. It was unable to solve any problem. First of all, national question, which was the real reason why it existed in the first place. And it was broken up by history. So people who are Yugo-nostalgic in this Gnostic sense are always trying to prove that it was broken up by nationalism of those respective peoples. Some like to stress Serbs, some Croats, never mind. That this is not important at this level. What they fail to see and are terminally unable to see is that it was broken up by its own principle, and people who led in its broke up and starting of war were in fact members of Yugoslav establishment first and foremost. Now, why those people are doing this? Why they are dreaming about this? Those are people who consider themselves to be universalists in morality. So one of them says that only those principles that are universal can transcend the tribal, nationalistic, genocidal divisions, because nationalism in this part of the world for the left, coming from traditions of Yugoslav communism, is a curse word. It's when in Yugoslavia, if somebody wanted to slander you, he would call you a nationalist. Although nationalism is not that. Nationalism has a very profound meaning. And of all the ideologies of modernity, it is the strongest one. So you at least have to give it credit for that. And now this guy, and I'm talking about here about concrete person, a journalist. He says that these universal principles exist only as Yugoslav principles. Now, this may sound crazy to you because it is crazy. He was not, mind you, talking to foreigners. He was talking to people from ex-Yugoslavia. So the universal principle, for instance, that every man has a right to defend himself in a court of law, cannot be practiced in Croatia. It cannot be practiced in Serbia, in Bosnia. It can be practiced only in Yugoslavia. Very explicitly, it says. Now, this maybe you don't see connection if you are from further west. I see it immediately. This is because he is a nationalist. Because you cannot live in Eastern Europe, especially in Balkans, without being some kind of nationalist. Because nationalism here is to an extent the expression of tribalism, and we are all tribal here. As much as in every lesbian relationship here, you know who wears the trousers also. So these Western wokeisms and such things are only pure formality that gives kinda form to what is in its real content pretty primitive. We are all primitive. We are all peasants here. Anyway. But some peasants are worse than others, and those are those who think they are not peasants. So you see what happens here. This guy, for instance, as a journalist, was supposedly always on a mission to uncover the the political ills, the corruption and such, and was a pretty good writer. And a lot of people buy into that this is his motive. But with Voegelin's help, you can see that this is not the case. I will not quote again because this is already going for pretty long. But at one point he writes about Puritans in England and how they were analyzed by Richard Hooker, Anglican theologian, who talked about them. And he said that this very interesting thing that they take from Holy Scriptures some passages that they use to form a kind of ideology in which they were the only pure Christians and so on and so forth. I'm simplifying for the sake of brevity. And then, through this, attacking all kinds of social evils and laying the blame for that evil at the feet of the powers that be, of the royalty, of the aristocracy of England. And he says people here, upon hearing them, believe that these men are completely good because they are so devoted to fighting evil. And they start to cheer them. But you see, this is not true. What they are fighting for and what they are maniacally devoted to is their cause. And all their exposition of corruption of people in power comes because they want to be in power in a quite different way, in a way that will be 100% uncorrupted. And these are Gnostics. And this applies, and I'm talking from my experience, and of course this would be more appropriate to do this subject in Croatian to the people who are in the know, and there will be something like that. But I think it's worth sharing because we'll go further to Gnosticism in a present age that we can all relate to. But this is one very concrete example, and I use it not so much because it's paradigmatic, but because it is so well hidden from view if you don't really plunge into depths. Because a lot of those people, if you asked me in the 90s, I would say the same as this average Englishman would say for Puritans. I never liked them. I sensed that something is wrong with them. But if some journalist says that, I don't know, this army unit killed 2 civilians and he is right, then he is right. Of course. Doesn't matter which army was, what civilians there were, he told the truth. And now, only now, we discover, for instance, a lot of those journalists that, in a lot of cases, that was of the corruption they supposedly discovered or ills that they laid before the feet of the then government were not really always true, but never mind. What is very important is a total, absolute rejection of existing order. There is no such social order that can be absolutely evil. There is no such thing. Such thing does not exist. And let us get back to the beginning, what Voegelin says, to see why is this. Because social order is a reflection and expression of something that is more fundamental, or rather more profound, and I would rather say higher, because it's better to think in terms of high and low, than any social order. But it is therefore completely impossible that there is an absolutely evil social order. The thing is that Gnostic hates the existence, and conversely, and more fundamentally, hates the creator. He wants to remove the given. The given means that there is a giver, and he is not the giver. He wants to be creator of a given. And this is what it means to have a dream world. And the consequence of this is consequences in a social reality are devastating, because these people are completely incapable of practical politics, of solving practical questions, because their question is not practical. They, for instance, Yugo-Gnostic cannot solve any problem Croatia has because he wants Croatia not to be. It is a country that is, they call it sometimes the ruined project, but Croatia as a land is not a project, it's a historical fact with very deep history, being inhabited by the people going by the name of Croats for quite a long time, and it's a thorny, boring, painful, tedious history, but it is reality. This is what they don't want. They want something else, and this comes from this horror of existence, from not accepting existence. And why this happens? Well, Voegelin uses ingenious term for this. I think it's his term, or he borrowed him from somebody, I don't remember. He's very scrupulous. If he borrowed it, you'll certainly, when you read Voegelin, find out from whom. It's pneumopathology. I would rather call it nusopathology, but okay. The disease or pathology of spirit, not of soul, of psychopathology. Pneumatopathology is disturbance of the metaphysical understanding. This is a disturbance, I would go forward and say, in line with what we do usually on Kali Tribune, this is the peculiar event when someone loses his mind in a quite literal sense. Lose mind is to lose the permanent touch that mind has with being. And this permanent touch is what is always present, but in order to be realized, you have to ask the forbidden question, the question of origins. This they forbid. This they forbid even in a way that you cannot have any more university where somebody can talk openly in this way, to ask these questions and come to certain answers, something that Voegelin still could do, and he praised the American university for being very conductive for this kind of inquiry, for this, what he called in fact the legacy of Mediterranean, European, Middle Eastern tradition, Near Eastern, tradition. And Gnosticism is, and he locates it very concretely, Gnosticism is precisely focused against this tradition. And this loss of one's mind is something that is not so easy to notice. This is not one who is like that. Can be quite normal, quite moral man in some sense, because it's easy today to be moral, because moral decisions are more or less about what you publicly approve or disapprove of. They don't carry with them much risks. In a case of Yugo-Gnostics, some of them were very courageous for their cause because they were in conflict with authorities. But also, they were never in the position of trying to construct anything, because they cannot be in that position, because what they want to construct is to create a dream world. So they are always either intellectuals or journalists or writers. They are never... there was a time in Protestant Revolution when there were pastors, now or Puritans. So now they are not. Now they are journalists. But I think that's the same thing in the end. What they have in them is terminal inability to be in touch with reality. I remember listening just yesterday to one of those people, pretty intelligent man, but also infected with this Gnosticism. When he was talking about Yugoslavia, how today, for instance, he's a Serbian, and how the Serbian society of today is not corrupted because it's Serbian society, but it was corrupted as a part of Yugoslavia, where everybody was bought off by the regime, and this is 100% true. Yugoslav communists ruled by giving you something, not by taking you something away. That's why all those countries are still screwed up, more so than Hungary or Romania or others that had much stricter and harder regimes, because people were given 13 wage a year, there was so-called kapetnost, K15, addition to your salary and so on and so forth, syndical travels for workers, coming to work whenever it pleases you, sometimes, not everywhere, but it was kind of principle, stealing tools, such things. That was all tolerated, but it all costed something, and that economy broke down. But then, after half an hour, he starts talking about Yugoslavia in the early 80s, had reached the prosperity of Western states and freedoms. And I'm listening to him, and I just can't believe. I feel sorry, not for him, for myself, that I have to listen to such things still in 2020. So he contradicts himself totally. He sees two contradictory images as one thing. This is one example. These people, if they were in power in some way, would bring about absolute catastrophe. Not because they are bad, it's because they are mad. in a metaphysical sense. They are not deranged or something. They are deranged in a way that they reject something that is fundamental in man, and this is the asking of original question. And this original question, mind you, has a form, in philosophy at least. Why is this world such as it is? You may have heard other question. Why is there a being and not nothing instead? Something that is usually, this second usually being related to Leibniz. Leibniz was first. It was first ascribed to Leibniz. These questions, I would disagree, for instance, with Voegelin here. He says that both questions go together. They don't go together. Aristotle, for instance, whom he loves so, never asked the second one. And there is a reason why. Because there is no nothing. And this mind shuns nothing. Mind thinks being, not nothing. But this is the story in itself. To lift, to let's say, rise the discussion in conclusion to a global scale, Voegelin had very interesting ideas about the end of the Second World War. He says that the ending of this war was quite unlike any other ending. There were no peace treaties. It was complete destruction of ideological enemy, Nazism and fascism, but also a stalemate with Gnostic Empire, as he called it, communist bloc. That was, in his opinion, it was possible to counter it in some way. And this gave that he was of the opinion that Western powers created intentionally a power vacuum. And that those powers also have these Gnostic leanings. Now, this is something that he wrote, I think, in early 60s. If he was alive today, I wonder what he would say. Because by his principles, today, the Gnosticism is a principle of global politics, not politics of globalism, but politics of Western states in general. You know why? Because I will give you my opinion. I noticed one thing. I noticed that nobody, for instance, in the European Union and the nearest neighborhood, can act politically. Nobody can do anything. You know what it means to act politically? Declare war, among other things. Most unpleasant and most dangerous of all, but this is ability to act. To do something autonomous in relations to your neighbors. To change fundamentally some laws that prove to be to your disadvantage, but seem to be in line with, for instance, these standards of civilized European Union. Nobody can do anything. You know what this is? And this is something that Voegelin calls a calling card of Gnostic politics. Inability to act. They cannot act pragmatically. They cannot, because they don't have relation to reality. They have a dream world instead of reality, where this dream world of society is projected on the being itself. The society, this little island in the sea of demonic chaos, of demiurgos, miscreation, is everything there is. And if it falls down, everything falls down into hell. Because there is nothing else. There is only the salvation that Gnostic created. And if you think about it, in the West, this is the principle of politics. I mean, when you remember these refugee immigrant crisis that is ended up being alleviated to an extent, the decisions of some European leaders, as Angela Merkel, could not be explained in a rational sense, in my opinion. could not be explained by anything but by complete madness. Because to say to objector that he is inhuman because he questions the politics of practically inviting millions of people to come walking into your country, if you consider this objection immoral, then you are insane. I don't mince words here, because this is something that is part of reality and part of that fact that we cannot be absolutely good because we are no angels, because we have to be good towards ourselves also. You have to preserve yourself to preserve others. This was completely in the face of slap in the face of reason. Of course, white nationalists and others made this into thing that is bigger than it really was, I think. But there was this flash of lunacy that, for instance, Voegelin would no doubt call Gnostic. I think with full right. So today we have a lot of this. Now, when we say, for instance, and I finish on this note of homosexual marriages or transgenderisms and such things. I know that people listening to this question those things. I don't question them. I consider them to be insane, because I'm old enough to remember when you could very well know that they are insane. And everybody would agree with you. The very fact that not only would a good mass of people not agree with you, but would throw you out of the society, means that this dream world of Gnosticism is in power. Think about it. If Voegelin is historically right, not only in a sense of history of ideas, but of real movements, we are ruled by Christian heresies. That is to say, in the best case scenario, I mean in the sense of Marcion's gnosis or Albigenesian, but a good deal of these Gnostic teachings from the ancient world, where it's arguable whether even Christian informed heresies of Christianity, or rather some different, very obscure and strange cults that maybe took some of the Christian symbols with destructive intent. We are, if that's right, and I'll leave the question open, that we are ruled by the refuse of history, refuse of what used to be form of decent society. I mean, no wonder then that it is very, very hard to talk about reality these days. And this is extremely dangerous, and I'll conclude on this note. I'm living, for instance, if I could be personal for a second, in a place that cannot afford, in which people cannot afford to live by Gnostic principles. Reality is too close. Somebody can roll the tanks on your streets, over your streets again. There can be war again. There can be this. There can be that. Those are relatively poor societies. Geopolitically, on the cross section of competing interests of greater powers, you cannot be Gnostic in this. And even Gnostic creation as Yugoslavia ran its course by being ran not by ideologues but by secret services, the most practical of men you can imagine. All communist societies end up being run by them, because this is only natural thing, because ideologically in that society, to make it Gnostic, to make it ideological, to make it communist, you have to brainwash people, because that doesn't work that good in the long run with communism. Then at least you have to run each and every nook and cranny, and the only thing you can do is to turn the government, in fact, the real executive power, into Secret Service that runs everything. But that's a story in itself. That's more like sociology. Sociology as social satire, because sociology of post-communism cannot help but being satirical. Anyway, that was my 2 cents on Eric Voegelin. A very interesting thinker. Of course, I would have some objections to what he says, but I really recommend reading him. There are some YouTube lectures of him also very good, so check them out. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.